Well, good waning morning, everybody.
Could do the intro again?
I'm Dan
I think it's working.
with the Wadena City Library,
Thank you.
and I hope you're doing well today
Thank you
and
so much.
joining us for this Bookends presentation from the Wadena County Historical Society, where we have interesting conversations with authors on a Saturday every single month. And just to start, this is what we have to read for every arts that we program that we get a grant for. Bookends is made possible through a grant from the Five Wings Arts Council, thanks to a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund to the Wadena County Historical Society. This month, Bookends will feature the work of celebrated Midwestern poet, essayist, and author Thomas R. Smith. You can see selections of his poems right now through the end of September at Green Island. In his recent book, Poetry on the Side of Nature, which will be on sale after this presentation, Thomas R. Smith aims to inspire and equip writers at all levels of experience to employ the nature poem as advocacy for the natural world. The Zoom recording of this program will be available on YouTube. If you have questions for today's author, feel free to put a message in chat. Now let's welcome poet, essayist, and editor, Thomas R. Smith.
Let's see. Okay, got a nice halo here, but believe me, it doesn't have anything to do with virtue.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm gonna do kind of a little free range talk about this book. It's called Poetry on the Side of Nature, Writing the Nature Poem as an Act of Survival. It's a prose book. It's a long essay that features about 30 poems by different poets that I use to make my case. And where I start is with a consideration of what exactly do we mean when we say the nature poem. Okay, so that's the starting point. And it may not get much farther than that because there are a lot of intricacies to this question. But since I am in Wadena right now, I wanted to read a poem by Robert Bly. It's not a well-known poem, but it mentions Wadena. I thought you should know that your town here has been named in Robert Bly's poetry. Can everybody hear me all right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, good. There's a couple seats up front here if anybody's having trouble, but I'll try to maintain my volume. So this is called Error While Driving. All afternoon, I drove through the snow-covered hills. The power lines slant in, then shunt away, as if into brooding. As if into brooding. A Finnish barn, still unpainted over the fields, slips slowly along, and the bushes along the fence line move so fast. Near Wadena, I thought a black mailbox moving across the snow was a moose. So that's my bow to my teacher, Robert Bly, and also to Wadena. So just to open this question, what is the nature poem? That was where I started. And let's see, where the heck are my notes? Here we are. All right. So who do you think of as poets when I say, nature poet? Can you just give me a few names? Frost, yeah.
Just the one goal.
Yeah. Who else?
I'm trying to remember name.
Oh, okay. Couple more. Well, there's a couple that I can think of that are very prominent. Anybody? No more? Okay. How about Wordsworth?
Yes.
How about Mary Oliver? We're getting We're getting some kind of strange feedback here.
It's me. I'm logging on to do the.
Okay. So it's okay. Well,
Do you think
yes.
Whit? I can't think of his full name.
Whitman?
Whitman.
Sure. Yeah.
Oh,
Walt Whitman
okay.
definitely fits. At least part of him does. And he's very large. So I noticed over the years that there was a tendency for especially more urban-centered people to dismiss the whole genre of nature poetry as being something that was irrelevant to them and out of their experience. What I came to, though, was that what we think of as the nature poem in Western literature, and I'm going back particularly to the English Romantics and the New England American Transcendentalists, what we think of the nature poem is a particular subset of poetry that hasn't been well defined. I started to notice this as I was reading more deeply into these poets. And what I saw was that the Western nature poetry, as we understand, the Western nature poem, as we understand it, is at its roots connected to protest over environmental degradation. Okay, that was my insight. One of my great sources in this thought was the English Shakespeare scholar Jonathan Bate. Around the turn of this century, he published a book called The Song of the Earth. And it's a book about ecopoetics. And it changed my way of seeing the nature poem. So in a certain sense, I'm building on what Jonathan Bate was writing about 20, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, 35 years ago. So poets, of course, have written about the natural world worldwide in all cultures. I mean, we have that fine tradition, particularly of the haiku writers of Japan and the Chinese poets, classical Chinese poets, and the classical Greek and Roman poets also wrote about nature. I mean, we have always, as humans, we have always included the natural world in our poetry, but what we call the nature poem, I'm convinced, is a slightly different kind of animal. And I see it arising essentially in England as a response to the first industrial revolution. The first industrial revolution dates roughly from 1760 to 1830. So there's this about this 70-year period spanning the 18th and 19th centuries, where the English Romantic poets such as Wordsworth and Shelley and John Clare and John Keats all rose into prominence. And they were beginning to see the destruction and the degradation of what William Blake in the poem Milton calls England's green and pleasant land. Okay? So to me, this is where the modern nature poem really comes from. Are you following me so far? Is this making sense? Okay. So the tone of the nature poem as they practiced it was a direct response to what they were seeing in the degradation of the English landscape. And I talk about that quite a bit in my book. About the first 30 pages is a short history of the Western nature poem. But what I wanted to do was I wanted to pick an example of the British nature poem as practiced by Wordsworth. This is a long poem. It's called Nutting, and that's why I've included in the handout, because I know that the diction may seem very formal by present day standards. It might be a little easier just to follow the thought here, but I'm going to say a few things about it after I've read it. Okay, so nutting, and this is the practice of going out and harvesting wild nuts in the English countryside. Let's see. Let me have some more water here. It seems a day. I speak of one from many singled out, one of those heavenly days that cannot die, when in the eagerness of boyish hope, I left our cottage threshold, sallying forth with a huge wallet o'er my shoulders slung, a nutting crook in hand, and turned my steps toward some far distant wood, a figure quaint, tricked out in proud disguise of cast-off weeds, which for that service had been husbanded by exhortation of my frugal dame, motley accoutrement of power to smile at thorns and brakes and brambles, and in truth, more ragged than need was, or pathless rocks, through beds of matted fern and tangled thickets, forcing my way, I came to one dear nook unvisited, where not a broken bough drooped with its withered leaves, ungracious sign of devastation, but the hazels rose tall and erect, with tempting clusters hung, a virgin scene. That word there is very important, by the way, a virgin scene. A little while I stood, breathing with such suppression of the heart as joy delights in, and with wise restraint, voluptuous, fearless of arrival, eyed the banquet. Or beneath the trees I sat among the flowers, and with the flowers I played, a temper known to those who after long and weary expectation have been blessed with sudden happiness beyond all hope. Perhaps it was a bower beneath whose leaves the violets of 5 seasons reappear and fade, unseen by any human eye, where fairy water breaks do murmur on forever. And I saw the sparkling foam, and with my cheek on one of those green stones that fleeced with moss, under the shady trees lay around me, scattered like a flock of sheep. I heard the murmur, and the murmuring sound in that sweet mood when pleasure loves to pay tribute to ease. And of its joys secure, the heart luxuriates with indifferent things, wasting its kindliness on stocks and stones and on the vacant air. Then up I rose and dragged to earth both branch and bough with crash and merciless ravage, and the shady nook of hazels and the green and mossy bower, deformed and sullied, patiently gave up their quiet being. And unless I now confound my present feelings with the past, ere from the mutilated bower I turned, exulting, rich beyond the wealth of kings, I felt a sense of pain when I beheld the silent trees and saw the intruding sky. Then, dearest maiden, move among these shades in gentleness of heart, with gentle hand touch, for there is a spirit in the woods. Okay, powerful poem, powerful poem. And by the way, just for what it's worth, historically, at the time that Wordsworth was writing this, his diction was considered to be very modern compared to the usual run of the English poets, and you can hear it in the vigorous energy of the poem. So this is written sometime 1799. That's right. Yeah, 1799. So it's right in the middle of all this that I've been talking about. Okay. So we notice some interesting things about this poem. One of them is that it credits some kind of indigenous spirit to the woods themselves that was not the standard English view of nature at that time. It's more resonant with Native American and indigenous worldwide views of the spirit in nature than it is with Wordsworth's own society that he was coming from. So that's significant. And I think that the some of the language that he uses describing the grove as virgin, and then what he shockingly does with it, you have this sensible, sensitive sensibility that's displayed through most of the poem. And then all of a sudden he's up there just knocking them down and tearing down the branches and really laying waste to the place. I find that shocking every time I read it, just the ferocity of it. So thinking about poems like this, and there are many, especially in the works of John Clare. I have one in the book, but it's even longer than this one, and a little bit less direct. Seeing this, I realized that there was a buried subject in the poem. The subject of this poem, in my view, is not the act of going out and gathering nuts. It's kind of the ostensible subject, but there's a subject underneath that subject, and it's Wordsworth's own feeling of guilt over having really spoiled, at least for a time, that beautiful natural place. But on further consideration, I don't believe that even that is the real subject of the poem. I tried to dig a little deeper than that, and what I came up with was the real underlying subject of this poem and of many, if not most, modern nature poems in the West is the sense of distance that we alienated moderns in a technological age, increasingly technological from the Industrial Revolution on, feel between ourselves and the natural world. Okay, are you with me on that? Oh, okay.
That's especially true from that, where he says a temper known to those who after long and weary expectation have been blessed with sudden happiness beyond all hope. He's still that young, fresh boy going out and very, very happy that he found all this. Well,
Yeah.
when do you think he was? Because I don't know what Dane meant, but that is master or his wife.
It may even have been his sister. And around the time that this was written, he would have been around 30 years old.
Oh.
So this was no errant child. So this led me to the concept that I explore in the book of what I call the distance. And I really believe that the aim of most nature poems that we write now is to close that distance that we have inherited, through our culture and that we feel towards the natural world. So I wanted to give a more contemporary take on that, and I thought, well, who better than Mary Oliver? Some of Mary Oliver's poems are very familiar to us. I don't believe this one is so much. Maybe should be. So this is called The Sun. Have you ever seen anything in your life more wonderful than the way the sun every evening, relaxed and easy, floats toward the horizon and into the clouds or the hills or the rumpled sea and is gone, and how it slides again out of the blackness every morning on the other side of the world, like a red flower, streaming upward on its heavenly oils, say, on a morning in early summer, at its perfect imperial distance. How's even that word there? It's perfect imperial distance. And have you ever felt for anything such wild love? Do you think there is anywhere in any language a word billowing enough for the pleasure that fills you as the sun reaches out, as it warms you, as you stand there empty-handed? Or have you too turned from this world? Or have you too gone crazy for power, for things? Okay. So do you see some continuity between those two poems? I see a direct line of descent. Yeah, question over here.
And about when was this written? About what year?
The Mary Oliver poem? Oh, I suppose
I'm trying to
late
look it up right now.
late 80s, early 90s, I would say. Yeah, yeah. Not that long though. I mean, could have been written yesterday. Nothing really marks it in time. Are you surprised by the turn that it takes there at the end, from that kind of appreciation to, suddenly the questioning?
I'd say it gets accusatory at the end, which I like.
A little bit, but don't you also think that some of this accusation is self-directed? Because I do. I think she was very capable of that kind of self-examination. Okay.
It's 1992.
Well, 92. Okay. Yeah, that's about right. So, yeah,
Could
Bill.
you read the last lines of the poem again?
The last lines. I'll start about 4 stanzas from the end. Do you think there's anywhere in any language a word billowing enough for the pleasure that fills you as the sun reaches out, as it warms you, as you stand there empty-handed? Or have you too turned from this world? Or have you too gone crazy for power, for things? Okay.
Thomas, when you read that, you point.
Very
I'm pointing at myself because I'm on the screen right up here. So yeah, I mean, I think we're all implicated. I wanted to make I'm not going to read anything by the transcendentalists, although I have them in the book, but I wanted to say something about that period in.
But there's a little irony there too, didn't you think? Because
What's that?
there's irony because
Irony.
it says that you two gone crazy for power. What's more powerful than the sun?
Well, yeah, I think though she's talking about the other kind of power,
But that power never
Yeah,
stops, even
yeah,
when
yeah,
it's dark.
yeah.
It's still there.
Yeah.
Giving
Yeah,
us.
that's true. I mean, you could say that's legitimate power. It goes back to something in a way that Emerson said. Emerson, this is a quote from Emerson. Things are in the saddle and ride mankind. Things are in the saddle and ride mankind. I'm just. Oh yeah, here it is. Okay, so the English, no, excuse me, the American transcendentalists are writing somewhat later, a generation or two later than the English Romantics. So they're very solidly 19th century. And there's a wonderful book by Leo Marx. It's called The Machine in the Garden. Does anybody know this book? This was a book that one of my English professors in college strongly recommended to me. And I finally read it, God knows how many decades later when I was researching this book. And the subject of the book is, the coming of industrial expansion to the North American continent. I was rather amazed to find in this book, and this is just a sidelight, that Shakespeare's play The Tempest is supposedly set in the imagined American paradise. I had no idea.
What did you call it? The what of darkness?
What's that?
What did you call it? The what of darkness?
The book?
Yeah.
The book is called The Machine in the Garden.
Oh, the machine in the garden.
Yes, The Machine in the Garden. And so there's an economic scholar named W.W. Rostow that Leo Marx quotes in that book. And he believes that the young American Republic reached what he calls a takeoff stage around 1844. And by the takeoff stage, he means that this sudden precipitous increase in the reach and power of transportation, communication, and production took place right around there. Here's a quote from Marx. Rostow defines the takeoff as the great watershed in the life of modern societies, when the old blocks and resistances to steady development are overcome and the forces of economic progress expand and come to dominate the society. The locomotive associated with fire, smoke, speed, iron, and noise is the leading symbol of the new industrial power. It appears in the woods, suddenly shattering the harmony of the green hollow like a presentiment of history bearing down on the American asylum. So the idea of this idyllic, American continent that Europeans were hungry to inhabit, it suddenly really basically exploded around 1844, according to Rostow. Now, the great writers and poets of that time were divided. Thoreau was against it. He was against the expansion of the railroads. Hawthorne wasn't keen on it either. Whitman, on the other hand, being the great booster of American expansion, was for it. And Ralph Waldo Emerson was pretty positive about it too. Matter of fact, Emerson called America, quote, the country of the future. Well, look out, look out. So these are some of the thought currents that I'm working with in this book. There's another quote from Leo Marx that I would like to find here in my unruly notes if I can. I think it's toward the end, and this stuff is all in the book. So if you want to find this in a more cogent, coherent argument, it's all there. So Marx's book is a book of the 60s. It's a quintessential book of the 60s. He underlines a long-standing cultural divide, quote unquote, separating those Americans who accept material progress as the primary goal of our society from those who, whatever their ideals of a fulfilled life, do not. So in a certain way, he views these as a persistent expression of what Henry Adams formulated as, quote, the ancient war between the kingdom of love and the kingdom of power. So the kingdom of power, against which conservationists and other defenders of environmental health have waged ongoing battle, still exerts its corrupting influence on too many of our elected officials. That's me. That's my comment. Okay. So how are we doing for time here? I don't want to blab on too long. Okay, I got till about 12:30. Is that right? something like that. Okay.
You're welcome to go longer.
I'm welcome to go longer. I might go just a touch longer because there was one there was one other part of this book that I wanted to bring up. And it was it was a certain reformulation of the reach of the nature poem. Now this is something that I've been wrestling with personally as a poet. I think part of the prejudice against the nature poem that some people have is that it seems to really just be, it's about birds, or it's about trees, or it's about clouds, or it's about rocks, or, God knows what it's about, but it's not about us. That's kind of the boneheaded prejudice against the nature poem. And I've run into this in, a few people that should know better, right? So what that criticism is based on is an inability to connect the natural world to our own lives. I mean, in a sense, nothing is more fundamental to us than nature, because we are all part of it, and our lives all depend on the natural world, on the health of the natural world. But there's a certain strain of the nature poem that really sticks to observation and reportage. This is true. And that kind of nature poem tends to be written by by people who are scientifically educated. And nothing against it. We need it. It's also a way for us to educate ourselves about the natural world. You read a poem that tells you something about robins that you didn't know, or you read a poem that tells you something about cicadas that you didn't know. You're the richer for it, and it's a wonderful way to learn. But my decision to reformulate this as a genre arose from a desire to also include human imagination in the nature poem. So what I did was I came to an understanding of what I call three different levels of the nature poem. The first level of the nature poem is realistic reportage. Okay. I'm just getting my nature poems here. God, I'm so papers here that got disorganized this morning. So I'm going to give you an example that I use in the book of one of the more realistic poems. It's by the Litchfield poet, writer, conservationist Joe Paddock. Do you know him?
Yeah.
You know Joe Paddock? All right. So Joe knows what he's talking about when he writes a poem about a robin. And this is a poem about a robin. It's called Rooted. And he prefaces it with a quote from the Christian mystic Simone Weil. To be rooted is perhaps the most important and least understood need of the human soul. Okay. Mild spring afternoon, and a robin pushes his breast into dark, sun-warmed soil in Abellino's garden. The robin is calm and sure, breast to earth, resting, yet terrifically alive in the unseen net of energy. In a single chirp, robin life of mid-spring will burst into nest and pale blue eggs, and then feeding the enormous gape-beaked hunger of new life. But for this moment, the robin has found a spot he likes. He likes, too, this block of houses, hardwoods, lawns, and gardens. That dark eye first opened to this angle of light. Those thin feet, tiny robin claws, first bounced across these lawns. Head cocked to one side, this robin listened to a thin whine from beneath the sod, which aligned cell by cell the incredible swarming handful of him. For this robin, This place contains full health. Other places lessen him. The worms and fruits of this bit of earth are his flesh. In the green shadows of evening, he translates them into flawless singing. Through the cold months, colors drab, he waited in Arkansas until sun heat stirred the magnetic wing beats, brought him exactly here. Breasted into his bit of warm earth, he rests, so calm, so sure. So to me, that's a really wonderful example of the more realistic, I don't want to say journalistic, but it's a kind of the nature poem that really hews to observable, factual reality. And I think all nature poetry has to, in some way, hew to observable reality, even when human imagination enters in. Violations of what we know as fact don't work, as far as I'm concerned. So that this is the first kind. But there's a tremendous body of nature poetry that is metaphorical in nature. And this is a natural activity of the human sensibility, because we really share the essence of the natural world. And we have the natural capacity for seeing ourselves in nature, or for seeing nature in us as well. It goes back and forth. But some poems are more directly comparison based, or I say metaphorical. And yet at the same time, once again, while they bring in the human element, they can't violate what we actually know of the natural world. Now, in the book, what I did was I took 3 different poems to illustrate these different modes. But for easier comparison, I made them all be poems about birds. So for my example of the metaphorical poem was Robert Francis's poem, Waxwings. How many of you know waxwings, cedar waxwings birds, and their behavior? It's really important to this poem. They're very gregarious birds, and they're very playful. Or they appear to be very playful to us anyway. So Francis was a kind of modern hermit poet. He was an inheritor of both Frost and Emily Dickinson. As a matter of fact, he lived not far from the Dickinson house in Amherst, Massachusetts. And he lived in a really modest little cabin that he kind of humorously called Fort Juniper. So there's no doubt in my mind that this is how Robert Francis saw himself. And if you don't know his work, he's just a delightful poet. If you like this poem, go check him out. Waxwings. 4 Tao philosophers as cedar waxwings chat on a February berry bush in sun, and I am one. Such merriment and such sobriety. The small wild fruit on the tall stalk. Was this not always my true style? Above an elegance of snow, beneath a silk blue sky, a brotherhood of 4 birds. Can you mistake us? To sun, to feast, and to converse, and all together. For this I have abandoned all my other lives. So it's very metaphorical. He saw in the waxwings an image for himself, something that expressed a central vital element of his own personality. Can you see how he did that? Yeah. Okay. So that's the second one. The third one is what I call the speculative, or the really imaginative nature poem. And this is where the poet goes out on a limb and proposes an as if situation, or a certain kind of interpretation that can't be proven or disproven. But he's going out on a limb, or she is going out on a limb. And I couldn't find a better going out on a limber than D.H. Lawrence. D.H. Lawrence has written some of the most distinctive, amazing nature poetry of anybody in the West. So his poem Hummingbird is a speculation, in a way, of the hummingbird's prehistory or prehistoric ancestor. So once again, there's no way to prove or disprove this, but we also know that birds, as we know them, are descended from prehistoric reptiles, maybe a little bit of the pterodactyl in D.H. Lawrence's hummingbird here. And there's no doubt in my mind that Lawrence saw a little of himself in this too, because he was an irascible, fiery, to use his word in this poem, jabber, like jabber at those who he disliked or wanted to deflate, the hypocrites and pompous of his age. So, Hummingbird by D.H. Lawrence. I can imagine in some other world, primeval dumb, far back in that most awful stillness that only gasped and hummed, hummingbirds raced down the avenues. Before anything had a soul, when life was a heave of matter, half inanimate, this little bit of chipped off in brilliance and went whizzing through the slow, vast, succulent stems. I believe there were no flowers then, in a world where the hummingbird flashed ahead of creation. I believe he pierced the slow vegetable veins with his long beak. Probably he was big, as mosses and little lizards, they say, were once big. Probably he was a jabbing, terrifying monster. We look at him through the wrong end of the long telescope of time, luckily for us.
I
So
love that.
there's humor in that, right? And birders will tell you that hummingbirds themselves are a bit edgy, a bit irascible, can be fierce. So those are three examples.
What's the fourth one?
No, there are only three.
Oh, I thought you said there were four levels.
No, sorry, I
No,
haven't found the fourth level yet, if there are. So any questions or comments about this? Yeah.
I'm surprised in the
Yeah.
first one.
Yeah.
The use of the word avenues just kind of.
Mhm. Yeah, I don't think he means anything like a human constructed city. I think he's just seeing it going down some kind of primitive forest corridor. That's how I read it. Yeah, I know it's kind of jarring, isn't it? Anything else here? Any other questions about this?
Just out of curiosity.
Yeah.
Can you define what romanticism was or is? I mean, I've never been able to really quite grasp what the English romanticism, German romanticism, and the turn towards romanticism meant.
I think romanticism as a whole brings in a certain level of subjectivity that wasn't present in earlier poetry, and I think it also brings in a more active participation of the imagination. I think it tends to have a mystical side. It tends to go in a transcendent and ecstatic direction. Yeah, I guess that's how I would approach that question. I know that there are more technical answers to that, but in a feeling way, that's what I think.
You put it to words and I can see it,
Yeah.
and you describe what I see.
Oh, okay, good. Yes, there's a certain quote unquote romantic engagement with reality in the natural world that isn't as objectively oriented. Especially, with those poets, Shelley and Wordsworth, and Keats. So I wanted to I have a little section in this book called Practicing What I Preach. Since I'm a poet too, I haven't read any of my poems. I wanted to read you an example each of my practice of these three levels, because I don't think any one poet is necessarily constrained to writing the same kind of poem all the time. And I know that I like variety. So I'm going to pick out for you three poems in sequence that I think, belong to these categories. And then, I think I'll just open it up to questions and discussions. There are a lot of ideas in this book. I really had a good time just kind of stewing this thing down, over a year's period from some teaching I had been doing at the Loft Literary Center in Minneapolis. That's how it really began for me. So I'm going to read a more realistic poem. It's a prose poem, and it's called Sympathy for the Wasps. And I was thinking about this yesterday at home because I was seeing the wasps gathering up against the eaves of the house in this warm weather. Sympathy for the wasps. The woman at the extension office says that the 24 or so wasps clustered under the roof eave of our porch are starving. They die off, she tells me, except for the overwintering queen who starts it all up again in the spring. They've long ago exhausted the small supply of wasp honey that fed them in the comb and grope feebly together as though blind, searching for sugar, using up their energy reserves because it's September and the sweets of the earth die back too. In full sun, they fan out on the joist, not venturing far from each other, seldom flying. Sometimes one flexes angular wings as if uncertainly testing the air, then retracts them close to its spindle body. Sometimes one looks down at me, returns my stare, antenna twitching. At dusk, they crowd together in a tight clump to conserve heat, withdraw into a shadowy depression. I kind of meant that in a double sense, actually. At dusk, they crowd together in a tight clump to conserve heat, withdraw into a shadowy depression. By day, they browse the painted wood dulled by weather, dust, accumulation of tattered spider webs, bits of captured debris. The low sun is bright and cool. The wasps are remarkably unaggressive. We have coexisted peaceably at close quarters for half a month. In warm hours, a few still whirl up against the south side of the house like wild flung honey. So I really felt actual sympathy for them, knowing what their situation was. We don't like wasps that much, but I've just gotten much more affectionate toward the insect world in later years. So that one is very realistic. And this is one that has metaphor in it. It's a different kind of metaphor than Robert Francis was using. It really turns, in a sense. Oh wow, that's great. I was really enjoying the train going by the motel last night. I watched out the window and it was dark, and I wrote a haiku, something like that. I think I remember it. Town lights spark between dark freight cars passing by.
Yeah.
Town lights spark between passing rail cars. No, town lights spark between dark freight cars passing by. I'm still kind of sorting out the syllables. All right, okay. So this is called Storm Island, and it started with an observation of something that was going on the river in the town where I live. And I end up thinking about immigration at the end. So it becomes a metaphor for immigrants and immigration. So it's a statement also, against the venom that's being directed at immigrants right now. Storm Island. At first, it was a single downed trunk jammed up against our downtown bridge footing, wishbone shape, wedged broadside the current. No one thought much about that river washed roost for ducks and geese. Years passed, and the rains returned. The river spread its muddy cloak over the bottomlands, gathering flotsam of storms to hasten southward on its brown, fast-moving flood. More branches hooked onto the lodged tree trunk. With each storm, the woody mass grew until it became an island patched together from the disparate, far-flung rack of generous rains. Its tight weave collected in soil in which new green life could root. The island, now a solid tangle of storm debris shaped by forces of circumstance and weather, challenges with its right to be here. Who has the strength or will to tear asunder those implicated limbs? Disasters uproot us, carry us along with their flow, lock us into each other. Surely bigger, wilder storms will bring new detritus to thicken our island. What right have we, storm-born, to refuse them? So I kind of saw this, this mass and it built up for years, and it probably doesn't say much for our city's maintenance, but it just started out as one just little, tree jammed up against the bridge footing, and over a few years turned into this kind of little island. Well, we're kind of like that too. So I wanted to give you my version of the imaginative one. And I'm going back to bees here. I guess I've just been more and more interested in insects over the past few years. So this is called The Queen in Winter, and it was inspired by, there's a man named Chris Hardman who puts out an ecological calendar. I don't know if he's still doing it or not, but it was wonderful because there would be one kind of fact a day. And I chewed on this one, The Queen in Winter. This is from Chris Hardman's ecological calendar. Unlike honeybees, which survive by huddling together in the winter, bumblebees only live from spring to fall, leaving only the queen to live through the winter. Okay, so that's the deal, there's this one little queen in an underground burrow, and she's keeping the whole thing going again. So I applied some images to this, some royal imagery. It doesn't really violate the reality of the situation, but it certainly embroiders it imaginatively. The Queen in Winter. She nods in her empty banquet hall, crown heavy on her sleek, heavy head. They are all gone. The soldiers and midwives, the blonde bearded boys and fleet golden girls, floating tapers that animated summer, snuffed not by darkness, but by cold. The flowers were sweet, but only a little less lasting than the burly pollen wranglers that hummed and sailed the hot breezes. Now earth hardens, streams flow to a standstill. Without and within, the castle door stiffens against white winds that bend the stems low. In her brain, the year dwindles to a dim star or the ghost of the last dandelion. Alone in the vast warmth of her sleep, she preserves in silence a royal word that will restart the world's stopped pulse and call back that court the wind has blown away. So So I would say that, maybe what a lot of these poems are too are exercises in sympathy or empathy, however imaginative, with our fellow beings on the planet. Michael Michael McCarthy is a British nature writer. He wrote a book called The Moth Snowstorm. Anybody ever seen that book? The Moth Snowstorm, and he's talking about the decline of wild species in Britain since World War II over agriculturalization. Talks about how in the old days of his childhood, his parents would be driving him along some country road, and the windshield would just be splattered with insects. There were so many insects. It was like a moth snowstorm. And how diminished the species are now in the British Isles. And I'm going to just conclude the formal part of this by quoting him. This kind of goes back to what Leo Marx was talking about, the kingdom of power versus the kingdom of love. Michael McCarthy says that we need a new kind of love, unquote. He says, it will be a love which is informed, but it will also be a love which recognizes in the scale of the threat is engaged, a love which, in delighting in a flower or a bird, or a meadow or a marsh, or a lake, or a forest, or a range of grasslands, realizes it may not be there next year and will do whatever it can to protect or save it. A love which can be fierce. So I think I think of everything I've seen in the last little while, I think what Kent and Vicky are doing out at Green Island just about fits that description of that new kind of love in action as much as anything I've seen lately. It's just been fantastic. So thank you. Wadena's very, very fortunate to have Green Island. Very fortunate. This is something unique. Let's see, looking at the time. Does anybody have any questions they would like to bring up? Obviously, there's a lot to talk about here. Yeah.
Well, I've been listening much to YouTube, and there have been so many discoveries in every field of science.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the strangest to me has been this vibration and frequency that exists in fields all around our being. Anything that's alive has its own electricity, its own magnetism. How are we going to fit that in with what? Now, I personally don't know what to believe about this, but our genetics are such that there are certain peoples that have Neanderthal, and they know that. But there are also other people that have this mystic type of thing. Could that be genetic?
Wow, that's a big question. Question is, there are energy fields all around us, and I'm just doing this in case this wasn't picked up. Energy fields all around us in the Earth. I mean, actually, everything that exists has some kind of subatomic vibration.
Which is why music is so wonderful.
Yes, that's true. That's why I'm
connected to poetry. Music.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So the question is, some people have a particular sensibility or sensitivity to this. You might even call it, a mystical sensibility. Is this genetic? Well, I don't know. I mean, this is one of the great mysteries. Where did Walt Whitman get Song of Myself and Leaves of Grass? He was this printer and journalist out on Long Island who all of a sudden had some kind of mystical experience, and it resulted in one of the most monumental mystical poems in our language and in world literature, you know, who knows?
Well, and so many.
Yeah, yeah.
Say mutants, they're
Yeah,
mutants.
yeah, yeah.
And I thought, maybe they really do have a connection, which just
Well-
plain people don't.
Well, why not? Why not? Anything else? Any other? Yes, Kent.
Can you do this? Can you say, what is it that motivates you to write? Because I'll just say, there could be many different reasons. You could do it for yourself. You could do it for others. You could do it because they have a message. You could do it because it's fun. What is it?
How about all of the above?
Okay.
What motivates me to write? I've been writing with some serious intent since I was 13 or 14. And part of the reason for that was that I received some encouragement from some older mentors, and I actually started to think of myself as a writer, and knowing that that is where I was going to go in my life as a teenager. And I have kind of gone through different stages of relationship to that avocation throughout my life. Why do I write right now? Well, it's to tell you the truth. You know, I use this in this book as a subtitle. I use the writing the nature poem as an act of survival, and in certain ways, my emotional survival as a person depends on exercising my creative abilities. And so I'm a lifer. If I don't write for a while, I still start getting kind of wacky. I start not feeling right. I process my experience through writing, and you know, I think you know, my intent has been to give something to other people and to the community and to the world through my writing that's useful and nourishing and positive and not negative. So I think that's a short answer to that.
So I was looking.
Oh, okay. So you're satisfied with that?
Yes.
Oh, okay, good. What else? Any other questions? Any other comments?
Just something
Yeah.
to think about
Yeah.
as we struggle at the library.
Mm.
I mean, bringing children in
Mhm.
because you know, we
Mm.
as we see children in their in their kindergarten through second, third grade, and then if their families don't bring them here so much, then we start to not see them at all.
Hmm.
So poetry is,
Mm.
I'm just thinking about um this naturalistic poetry
Yeah,
that you're talking
yeah,
about
yeah.
worlds of wonder are the are most accessible to children in the form of the storybooks. I mean, I could give you lots of examples of naturalistic verse
Mhm. Mhm.
in these storybooks and we're in the golden age of illustration. So that is something that can appeal um, to children, you know, so that
Yeah.
they can, you know, check out the natural world. But how do you think we can possibly try to incorporate more poetry into the education system? Doesn't seem like, I mean, being forced to do it in school might turn off a lot of kids from not only, you know, writing verse, but also being in nature. As they get older, you know, they tend to kind of cling to technology. So is there something we could possibly do?
Well, one thing that occurs to me is sometimes when I'm doing workshops, I'll bring in a box of kind of interesting natural objects. You know, I collect things around my home. I have birds' nests that have fallen out of trees and pieces of bark and bones and kind of beautiful or maybe not beautiful but interesting stones, feathers, shells, and stuff like that. And almost every age I've worked with, including grade school children, really respond to just reacting to a particular object that they pick out themselves. You put it out on the table and say, which one of these, really is saying something to you. And then they take it, and you could give them different kinds of instructions. You could tell them, describe it as best you can, or make up a story about it. That's one way to engage the love of story too with these things. Well, there was a bird and she had her children, but a storm came and knocked the nest out of the tree. And I mean, they're willing to go there. They're willing to go those places. So, that's something that comes to mind. I think if you have poets, if you have real poets come in and work with them who have different teaching toolboxes, you'll find a lot of good ideas for that. I think one problem with poetry now is that, especially with academic poetry, it's gotten so far from memorable or memorizable. The old rhymed and metered poetry was great for memorizing. Those were all mnemonic devices. So now, certain kinds of, especially fragmented, abstract free verse poems are not so great for memory or really direct engagement. In my opinion. If there's some delight to the sound, I think that's part of why hip hop is so popular. It's still got the rhyme, still got the rhythm. I don't know if any hip hop poets are writing about nature. That's the other thing, but still, I think there are clues there. So, maybe working with older poems, like some of William Blake's songs of innocence and experience, and poets like that. I know that many published poets who have gone on to do very different things were initially turned on by poets like Edgar Allan Poe. I mean, you wouldn't believe how many poets cite Poe, as like a primary influence. The bells, 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 rhyming in the chiming of the bells, 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 bells. I mean, it's infectious. Mary Oliver was excited by Poe, for instance. You never know it from her, from her adult poems, but a lot of us go back there.
Baudelaire.
Well, yeah, Baudelaire too.
I mean, Baudelaire he
Yeah,
fancied
he,
Poe.
he translated Poe into French. Yeah, yeah,
Had advertising and jingles and that.
yeah. That's true.
Bells.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, that's right. So, anything else, or is that enough to go on for a while? Well,
Well, thank you so much for coming.
Yeah.
So would you
yeah,
really appreciate that?
I'm really glad to be here, and I wasn't able to get a hold of as many copies of this for this trip as I'd hoped to, but I've got a few back there, and got some copies of this prose poem book, "Windy Day at Tabligona," which was kind of inspired by where Bill Booth had Cry of the Loon Lodge, where we spent many a wonderful week and weekend. And a couple other books of mine too are back there, and I'll be glad to have you run off with a copy and sign it for you. So I think I'll go back at the book table. All right. Okay. Thank you.